right. We're all go. Great. Hello, welcome back everyone. Big hello to our online audience. This could be for the first time more people watching online than in the room because there are people at lunch still, so this is very exciting. If you're an online person, you must be very crowded where you are streaming. Oh my God, this is so exciting. Oh, now more people are coming in. Oh no, oh, who knows, we'll upset the balance of that joke. Before I introduce the next session, if you are online and if you are in the room, please tweet along or share on social media using the hashtag 22 Better Futures Forum. If you're in the online audience and you need a reminder how to use this system, if you're just joining us, hit the event team or tech team up, search for event support. You get an instant chat box. There's a room full of people just backstage here who are dealing with all of that, and they'll get back to you straight away. Moderating this next panel is Andrew Petersen, who will introduce a lineup of leading voices in the business space that will delve into the issues that business say are critical and climate action. Australian businesses are committing to, I don't know what happened to this sentence. Australian businesses are committing to a successful road to net zero. Okay, Andrew has more than 25 years experience as a legal advisor on matters relating to environmental risk, law and policy, and 10 plus years of experience as CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. He's had a ton of government appointments around waste, packaging, sustainability and biodiversity, and most recently he was appointed by the Victorian Government to the Clean Economy Skills Jobs Task Force. And back in 1993, Andrew did the paperwork for Paul Keating's piggery. Yes, this guy is a living, breathing, walking moment of Australian political history. Please give it up for Andrew. Take it away.
Thank you for that. Okay, so conscious of online audience as well, let me stand over here, and in doing so, let me acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples of the Eora, not of the Eora Nation, that's incorrect, Andrew. The Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and we acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. This is a weird session. Why? Because we are seeking to challenge probably the last day and a half in relation to the conversation of, well, that's great, we've got the 43% in the bag, what next? So this session is designed to explore that next horizon, Horizon 2, and in doing so, a conversation around, well, what is the business role in relation to that opportunity? And to do that, we are going to be welcomed by an esteemed collection of experts, and in introducing them up onto the stage, if you'd like to take a seat and your microphone. So in no particular order, we have Brynn, we have Brett, we have Skye, we have Ilona, and we have Hudson. Would you please welcome them all? Thank you much. All right, so, and I'm conscious it's after lunch, and that's always the downtime, but we're going to ask you to get out your mobile phones or your tablets where you can, at least in the room. I'll come to those online in a minute. And in the context of this conversation, go and capture the QR code that's up on the screen. And if you haven't already, explore the survey that we have put out to ask the question, what is the role of a business manifesto for climate recovery into the future? Now, the context of this particular piece of work is that the organisation that I'm part of, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, put this particular manifesto out in 2021 in the lead up to the United Nations Framework Convention Conference on Climate Change in Glasgow. And it was a framing statement by that particular organisation around what it saw as the important elements that business needed to play a role into a future decarbonisation opportunity. And in doing so, it also identified what were the policy asks that it would need to ensure business played a role in if it were to do so. So we thought at the BCSD that we in Australia would ask this exactly the same question, but we take a slightly different approach, hence this expert panel, which is, okay, that's what business internationally says, but what about business in Australia? So as part of, and one of the co-chairs of the Corporate and Finance Task Force of the Better Futures Australia platform, I put it forward to the team that we might actually bring it to the conference, which is why you're here today, both here and online. And for those online, I think you will find it in the chat, a link in the chat function. And we want to get your insights, your thoughts as to what it is that business should play a role in. There are 12 priority questions, there are 12 statements, and there are 12 priority areas, and you can get to vote for those that you think business should play a role in asking government to support business in achieving. Okay, so that's the context. But we are conscious that business is only one of the key stakeholders in this conversation, and so that's why we have these people here before us today. And in the first case, what I want to do is hand over to Brynn, to give some opening thoughts as to the manifesto itself. So, Brynn, what do you think of it?
So I think, in an overarching sense, one of the most powerful roles that business can play is in positive lobbying to decrease real-world emissions. Sometimes we say positive lobbying in line with the Paris Agreement. I think that gives us too many excuses. I think we actually need to be getting business to exercise its tremendous political power, and we know in Australia that business does have an political power, to keep fossil fuels in the ground, to look for opportunities for real-world emissions reductions outcomes. So from an overarching perspective, I think there are opportunities built into this project to do that, but I also think there is the risk of greenwash throughout it. So, for example, objective number 2 is to make coal history. That should be make fossil fuels history. I note that, you know, the membership of your organisation in Australia doesn't include oil and gas companies. The membership of the global organisation does. So I think to the extent that there are the fingerprints of the global oil and gas companies, you know, BP and Shell, for example, in this document, they need to be scrubbed from it, and that will give Australian business really looking to flex its muscle to decarbonise the best chance of success.
Okay, so thank you for that framing, and definitely taken that on board. Let's move to Brett, and let's be entirely transparent. So Microsoft is a member of the WBCSD. Tell us what the, not so much the response by Microsoft is to this particular manifesto, but the position that Microsoft has put itself into in the narrative around international decarbonisation and the work that it needs to do in supporting its customers around this challenge.
Start me with a small question there.
Yeah.
So from a Microsoft standpoint, just a bit of context, we have a commitment to be carbon negative, water positive, and zero waste by 2030 while protecting more land than what we use. Much of the work that we've done and the role that we play, in all transparency, when we made our commitments or upped our commitments in January of 2020, we did so with huge observation bias. We did so because we felt they were the right thing to do, but not realizing how high it was on the agenda of the rest of the private and public, I should say private sector. It just wasn't things that we were naturally interacting with our clients on. And also this realization that we are very fortunate in terms of the position of our balance sheet. And so those that have the ability to do more should. And so everything that we've done, whether it be to advance policy or we're going to market for procurement of carbon removal, we've done so in a way that we want to share our lessons and learnings But we also want to share everything in terms of the terms and the contracts that we put in, how we assess some of the investments that we've made. We've invested capital. We have a $1 billion US climate investment fund that will put that capital or deploy it over 4 years. About half of that capital is deployed today. And so it's really been that this need that we have to be customers of, investors in, owners to the solutions that will ultimately require if they're going to scale, if there's actually going to be the supply there in the market to help us get to net zero.
So thank you for that, Brett. And one of the third policy priority is power up the green global grid, which obviously Microsoft has a very important role to play. And the overview of what it wants to see is invest in green energy grids to support decarbonisation of energy. What is Microsoft's current and ambition in relation to that particular issue?
Okay, so our goal is to operate with 100% renewable energy 100% of the time by 2025. You think about the data centers, the big boxes that you may see as you drive around. It's everything from procurement of renewable energy, multi-year investments in terms of PPAs for them, the generators that you see on top of them, swapping out the fossil fuels that are there today and using battery storage for it, looking at even the way that we operate them in terms of liquid cooling, getting technical, overclocking of machines. It's really been about making these, to my earlier comment around investors in, effectively investing in and trying to scale solutions that may work for a shorter period of time or at a smaller scale them out such that we can extend that footprint across the 153 countries where we have data centers today.
And before I jump to Ilona, so there's the flag, Ilona, I'm coming to you. What's the role of Microsoft in the cohort of those companies like Fujitsu and others around ensuring that this is achieved at scale, as distinct from Microsoft doing a really great job, but it's Microsoft and nobody else doing it?
Yeah, so look, for us, 97% of our emissions from a market-based standpoint are scope 3. It's up and down our supply chain. Much of the work that happens that I believe is most meaningful is with those suppliers. So in 2020, we put into our supplier code of conduct a requirement for reporting of all 3 scopes. Today, 87% of our suppliers do report and disclose their emissions. As part of that work, it's not just putting in a requirement, it was providing tools and resources. Last year, we've also begun working with the IFC, part of the World Bank, and specifically in Asia, to look with some of our most material suppliers from an emission standpoint, help them identify what are alternatives that they can use, offer them help with implementation and even discounted financing to help them make the transition. And so it's really been about continuing to invest up and down that supply chain, knowing that if we just go about our own operations, that's a small portion of our overall emissions.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move to a highly uncontroversial issue, which is number 8, fast-tracking natural climate solutions and also investing in nature-positive land use. Ilona, give us a sense of where we are at as business particularly, but also in engaging with other stakeholders, particularly in the UNFCCC process, around the issue of natural-based solutions, because it is, for what is controversial, and it is not seen as verifiable, it's not trustworthy, and yet business says that it is a key element of the way in which its portfolio of response is going to be necessary going forward.
Andrew, I think the starting point is thinking about what is the role of markets in the broader approach to decarbonisation. And I would say most people are all on the same page that when we look at the way that the mitigation hierarchy operates, you work through and for those emissions that are incredibly hard to abate sectors where there aren't technological solutions to swap out, you can then look at the role of offsets, but what you need to be looking at, and I think this is the view that's coming from groups like the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, is that you look to use high quality nature-based removals that not just offset emissions, also go beyond that in terms of removals that achieve nature positive solutions. And when we look at the statement in the manifesto about how do you sort of really fast track the development of these high quality nature-based solutions, there is the scale, but there's also the importance of getting to scale, maintaining the integrity of the frameworks that sit around verifying the additionality, the permanence, and the impacts of those interventions that generate the nature-based solutions. Those solutions are predominantly in areas that forestry, increasingly looking at blue carbon. All of these very much touch on land use, and so critically important is the interaction of those projects and activities with the traditional owners of the land, the communities that engage with those project activities, and ensuring that in undertaking those types of nature-based solutions, you're having a community-first perspective that respects human rights as well as contributes to achieving environmental outcomes. So where is business with all of that? I think we've seen for a long time businesses use offsets as part of the decarbonisation strategies. We're starting to see more guidance come out about the types of claims that can be made in association with the use of those offsets, so that what businesses need to be thinking about is adopting approaches that demonstrate that they are using those high quality, high integrity offset units. So there's a lot of discussion about the integrity of carbon markets, both internationally and here in Australia. The Chubb review into the Emission Reduction Fund is underway at the moment. People will no doubt be making submissions, looking closely at that in terms of the methods that we have and apply here in Australia, but also in terms of how we engage with communities in the Australian context when looking at project development and its impact on the land sector. Businesses are very actively engaged in these discussions all along the spectrum, from project developers to investors in projects to financiers to the buyers of the units who are then making claims with respect to them. And every sort of part of that chain needs to be thinking through those integrity issues.
Maybe if I can make a comment there, I think that's, for me, one of the areas where we need help. To put it in perspective, so in the last year, we purchased 1.4 million metric tons of carbon removal. We're one of only about 10 or 15 companies in the world that only purchase carbon removal for our hard-to-abate emissions. If you asked me that number a year and a half ago, I think it was 3 companies. In doing so, I would say we've had a lot of learnings. That 0.4 million metric tons, we feel we purchased the majority of the world's high-integrity supply. Those longer durability solutions, those high durability solutions today are just generally cost prohibitive for much of the private sector. That measurability, verifiability, like today our portfolio is 99% nature-based solutions and only 1% engineered solutions. And that need for any level of multi-year investment. And I think that's one of our big learnings of whether it's DAC, direct air capture, where we have made investments, a single year or a 2-year investment is not enough to help a technology scale.
Do we need, just before Brynn comes in here, do we need policy intervention in relation to that split? Do we need to say 99.1 fine for the first 5 years, but then after that you need to transition away from the use of natural-based solutions?
It may be a part of it, but if you had that requirement today, it doesn't help that market scale. Right? And so it's the financial capital, the human capital that needs to flow to it. And I think that's where, whether it be through subsidies or some other approach, there are mechanisms to actually help make I'll say the affordability of that market more approachable beyond only the top end of enterprise.
Yeah. Brynn?
I just want to pick up on something Ilona said around integrity needing to appear and kind of be scrutinised at every level. I think there's obviously a supply integrity issue in Australian carbon markets that is being worked through at the moment, but the issue that gets even less attention is demand integrity. You know, in my view, it's beyond time that companies like Microsoft, which have, you know, genuinely hard to abate parts of their business, get into, like, take the gloves off, get into a fight with companies like Woodside, like Origin, that are expanding fossil fuels production and are intending to offset the entirety of that expansion. I would love to hear what you think about that.
Dun, dun, dun. That's a conversation
or
around...
actually what Ilona thinks about it, because I know that there is a kind of, that people who work in carbon markets, people who advise companies on carbon markets, have a custodial role of the kind of intellectual frameworks that surround markets. Conversation I've had with the Carbon Markets Institute, who are, of course, you know, sponsored by, or they're major members of BP and Shell and Woodside. Like, we have an absolute demand integrity crisis in carbon markets that doesn't get nearly enough attention. I would love to hear what others on the panel think about it.
Well, before, as Ilona molds her answer, let me towards the conversation around what is the role of things like the safeguard mechanism rule that's currently also in review, and yet the government itself is not willing to allow a conversation in relation to the role of offsets in that particular policy review. So the question becomes, and this is manna from heaven when it comes to the manifesto, is what is it that we need to be sending signals to government as business about these very sorts of issues that needs to be addressed? So hopefully that's enough time for Ilona to think about her response. But we at BCSD have been thinking about, is there a need for a conversation that goes, here's your response to the safeguard mechanism, but there are more profound questions that are not being addressed around this review that must be put on the table if you're going to have a longer term, deeper, structural conversation around the systems changes that are necessary for an economy like Australia going forward. Ilona.
So I will approach Brynn's response, I think, somewhat diplomatically, but I think that when you look at the role of offsetting and net zero claims, and a number of large companies across all sectors are making net zero claims, I come back to the approach that's advocated for with the Science Based Targets Initiative, which looks at, you know, guidance around how you set your net zero frameworks and claims, and the role of offsetting within that. So if, for example, you are looking at having a 1.5 degree aligned claim for net zero by 2050, the amount of offsets you can use in making that claim is, I think, less than 10%. And so, you know, that gives some time for the transition by 2050, but ultimately, if you're going to be using a science-based target, setting a net zero claim, which is then covering your scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, your scope for using offsets is going to be very, very small if you're doing that level of alignment. If you then move to the issue around how companies are making claims today around their use of offsets, then I'd look to the guidance that's been coming through from the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. There's that initiative that is looking at things from a demand and a claims basis from the users of offsets. And they sort of point to the integrity of the offsets, the way in which those claims are framed in order to prevent and avoid greenwashing linked to those claims. You then have what was the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which has now become the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. All these ridiculous, I wouldn't say ridiculous, but all these acronyms. But they are then looking at the other side, which is how to scale the use of nature-based solutions, carbon markets, to deliver the investment that's needed to go into supporting nature-based solutions and removals, high-quality removals, in a way that, again, maintains integrity around the processes there.
Okay, so conscious that we could have an entire session on this particular topic in and of itself, and we will at a later date in another forum. Let us move on to one of the other priorities, which is cutting emissions in the built environment, which is manna from heaven for at least two of the other speakers on the panel. Firstly, Hudson. The challenge that we have posed in relation to that, if I can quote, target a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions from the built environment system by 2030, net zero emissions by 2050 by implementing bold national and local roadmaps and policies to create radical collaboration across all stakeholders to focus on the whole life cycle impact of building and infrastructure activity. Australia has been, for at least a number of years, some years ago, an absolute leader when it came to identifying and seeking to put in place systems, processes and standards in relation to CO2 reduction in the built environment. I could be wrong, but in the last couple of years kind of slowed down somewhat, challenged no doubt by, I guess, a number of different factors. But you're involved in a particularly interesting project that is rethinking the way in which it's going to be targeting that very kind of objective. So you want to share it with us and tell us what the ambition is and what you're currently doing.
Great, thank you.
If that's not a Dorothy Dixer, I don't know what is.
It is the perfect Dorothy. So I represent, I'm wearing a hat for MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance.
Another sexy title, yeah.
Yes, I've often, I'm going to go on Hard Quiz one time and just say, hi, I'm here to talk about embodied carbon. The reason MECLA is set up is we recognise that embodied carbon, you're right that the Australian built environment had a period of global leadership.
Stunning innovation.
And a lot of that comes back to the Green Building Council of Australia, who is a member of MECLA. But that was really focused on operational emissions and operational performance. And, many of Australia's listed property companies, the REITs, performed very well globally for that asset class. For other asset classes, not so much. And the emphasis there on operational performance. MECLA is, because embodied carbon hasn't been a focus until now, with WWF and my Small Business Precinct set up this group, and radical collaboration is the term used by Monica Richter, the Executive Director, who's my co-conspirator with...
And my co-chair of this particular task force.
Indeed. And radical collaboration, the idea, and it taps into what Brett was saying about the supply chain is complex, and for an organisation like an Apex organisation, like a Microsoft or, for instance, a Lend-Lease, who's also a member of MECLA, for them to say we're going to be absolute zero by 2040, which Lend-Lease has done, admirably so, no offsets. There's no way they can do that without their supply chain coming with them. And so we've taken a systems approach to look at, and it started at a whiteboard, looking at the project life cycle of a major development project. But we realised, look, it's just not linear. They're the time slots, but the decisions are made well before anybody gets on site. A lot of the professions are trained decades before that particular project. The standards were written based on last century's climate and last century's performance data. There's a whole system that goes into determining the embodied carbon that goes into a building. We are bringing that whole system into a conversation. We have 140 members. Delighted to say we have 140. We set out to have 40. But from all across the construction ecosystem, to start looking at, what are the levers, what are the barriers, and then what are the enablers to get past them, to start addressing the embodied carbon component in the built environment.
Okay, so that's the ambition. What's the action?
So the action is, we call ourselves a do tank. That's not to detract from think tanks by any means, but we don't want to be there for a long time. We've prepared a dictionary of embodied carbon, simply because the language is so broad and new. To have agreed terms, if you want somebody to specify something, they need the terminology to do it. We have another working group that is looking at bringing awareness to the industry about the measurement frameworks for embodied carbon, because there are EPDs, environmental product disclosure statements, that are very much bottom up, very data intensive, but for one particular material. If you're setting up all of Barangaroo or all of Adfa Campus, you want the whole picture, not just one material. So there's top down and bottom up, and somewhere in the middle comes an answer. We've got groups on steel, on aluminium, on concrete and cement to put forward where is the industry up to, what do they need, what can you do as a customer, and how can you start to reduce the embodied carbon in a project so that the engineers know what they can certify, the architects know what they can design, and a lot of carbon can be designed out, just like operational energy consumption can be designed out of a well-considered building. Likewise, embodied carbon. We've just held an event on pre-design to start informing the sector on that. So when we say a do tank, it's talking to the industry, what do you need, how can you do it? And ultimately, the objective is to have government, as one of the biggest procurement entities in the country, to start specifying carbon as a success metric. So price, time, quality, functionality, obviously, and carbon. And then have the industry respond with a race to the top to say, well, actually we can design that bridge or that football stadium with 20% less, 40%, 60% less embodied carbon than business as usual.
Or in the case of New South Wales, do we really need to rebuild the stadium that we've just rebuilt? But that's a different conversation.
Yes.
Skye, let's pivot to you because Hudson very helpfully talked about supply chain emissions and the issue of procurement. And what I would very much like you to share with us is what are you seeing in your KPMG world that your clients, in very high level terms, because you can't tell us in detail, what are they actually doing at the moment in relation to this challenge around decarbonising procurement? I'm fascinated by that one because it requires a very different level of trust that has not previously existed in contractual relationships amongst companies, let alone individuals.
I think in general, I'm seeing a lot of good intentions, and you're seeing it from the government side, and you can see good intentions from the business side as well. What I'm seeing is missing is them coming together, and it's just the mechanisms that are put in place through contractual frameworks or the procurement frameworks, and actually in general also having the skill set needed to have the expertise to be able to put these frameworks in place to make it happen. So that's what I'm seeing in terms of potentially it just not coming together as quickly as what we need for it to be accelerated. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context too around the built environment. So the World Green Building Council, if you may already be familiar with the level of influence the built environment has, but the World Green Building Council reports that 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are contributed from the built environment. 50% of that is embodied carbon, and that 75% of the infrastructure that's needed by 2050 hasn't been built yet. So it means we need to put these mechanisms in place so that we are all working together on these common goals as soon as possible. We have a term called sustainable procurement. So there's an international standard on sustainable procurement. The government has done a lot of work in terms of they have a sustainable procurement guide. It's actually really good. It's a great resource for everybody if you want to go learn more about how you actually embed these types of sustainable requirements. And when we talk sustainability, it's environmental, economic, and social. So there are things, there's guidance there already, and it's just a matter of taking the next step, having conversations. So, you know, anybody in whatever environment you're in, I think the most important thing is to ask the question. If you're not seeing things happening, ask the question, hold people accountable. Most organisations and government organisations have policies in place around sustainable procurement, but you may not actually be seeing it. So I think it's about making sure you're having these conversations in the workplace. Go look for whether there's a sustainable procurement policy. If there isn't, ask why there isn't. And I think we just need to keep those conversations happening while, I guess, you know, in the background, legislation follows. priority targets and commitments follow, because, you know, if we wait for government and business to be aligned on a commitment, we might be waiting a while. So I think it's important that we keep the action going at the level of influence that we can, while the rest, you know, happens. And I would agree that in terms of business, different, the larger tier 1 type businesses certainly can drive change and have more influence than what medium and small sized businesses do. And I feel like they do play a very important role in setting the expectation and setting up the frameworks and setting up, you know, we need you to do this for us. And that then in turn uplifts everybody's ability to respond to, you know, the outcome we're trying to achieve.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me, I was going to call out one of that aspect, but time doesn't allow us to do so, so I'll move on reasonably rapidly. What I wanted to do is a quick fire round of questions around the remaining priorities that we have with a yes or no, right? Only a yes or no, doesn't require full explanation. Just do you agree? So the first is mainstream methane reduction. Brynn, yes or no? Just do yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Brett.
Yes.
Skye.
Yes, but...
Thank you for the
yep,
claim.
okay.
Ilona.
Yes.
Thank you. Hudson.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, that's not going to have no rewriting on my part in relation to that one. The one that I find fascinating, because I still don't have my head around the truth of the narrative, is deploy decarbonised hydrogen.
Renewable hydrogen.
And that's where we got to in the preliminary conversation. Anybody want to dive into that little chestnut at the moment?
Look,
See, I told
the
you I put the
engineers I
Bunsen
talk
burner
to
on.
say that we've got a long way to go before we're deploying hydrogen, and I fully renewable. You know, the grey or the blue bullshit. It's green or it's not. But we're quite a way away from having that, and you know, the storage, the transportation, the electrolyzers, all of that.
We are, but we have major listed companies in Australia telling their investors right now that blue hydrogen is part of their strategy. So, like, we are a long way from deploying it, but we're not a long way from capital being allocated on the basis of representations being made to the market. And can I say, on greenwashing, like our market in Australia is just awash in greenwash. It is, no regulator is coming to save us, right? No voluntary initiative is coming to save us. We're so awash in it that my organisation, ACCCR, has started federal court proceedings against Santos for what we say is their greenwashing. Like, it's everywhere.
Yep, I'm very interested to see what comes out of that particular piece of litigation as a former lawyer. All right, so yes, but we have a lot of work to do in relation to the appropriate policy setting that we actually recommend to that. The other is, and we haven't talked about it that much during the course of the conference, which is transportation, or more broadly mobility. And in that case, the priority number 5 is that we will drive coordinated action between business in the electric vehicle value chain, policymakers and investors to accelerate the deployment of technology and infrastructure supporting increased EV sales to deliver a cut in road transport emissions of 30% by 2030. The radical in me says that's great, but don't we have an obligation as a society, particularly in this country, to decarbonise ourselves away from the vehicle itself? Is that not the aspiration that we should be thinking of? Anybody want to commentate on that?
I'd put a nuance in there saying maybe step away from the need to own the vehicle. I don't
Right.
think it may not be the vehicle that's the problem, it's having all the vehicles that are stationary so often. Because
But that then comes as a massive conversation around the business model of bringing that particular product to market in the first place.
Can't we do both? Can't we have policy settings that incentivise the transition as well as
Not if you're a white male
incentivising-
over 55. No, you
Okay.
can't. No.
glad I'm only
You can
49.
have everything.
And then you can have everything. Oh, edit. Okay, all right. Let us go to, we didn't really talk, Ilona, about investing in nature-positive land use, and it was brought up in the first session earlier today around the renewable export opportunity. I want to come back to that because you have a very unique year this year. Two COPs sitting side by side and in one sense not talking to one another about the inexorable nexus that exists between the two. Observations, not so much about the COPs, but the conversation about climate and nature.
Look, I think it's a great opportunity to achieve climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as achieving some of the objectives around avoiding nature loss, restoring our environment. I mean, anyone who's looked at the State of the Environment report will see what a critical situation we're in and the need to invest in land use change that will promote biodiversity, conservation and restoration. We need billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to do that, and so we've got to look at innovative kind of solutions to try and get finance flowing to the sectors where that change can happen, and that's again land use, forestry, agriculture. How do we make agriculture more sustainable? How do we retain our old growth forests but also create a sustainable timber industry as well?
And yet our experience at BCSD is that it is probably the least loved topic of the members, and I don't say that critically of the members. It is just, it's really hard to have a really deep conversation about the role of business in curating nature, whether that is from a value creation point of view or at least from a value protection point of view. So Ilona, then Brett, then Brynn.
I was going to say, I think that's where potentially some of the work of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure comes in. We've seen the impact that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure has had in terms of pushing companies and others in the finance sector to assess the physical and transition risks of their operations, develop strategies, put in place targets, and then report transparently on the achievement of those targets. If we go through that same process, hopefully at an accelerated pace in respect to understanding the nature-related risks, financial risks to operations, but also not just those risks of biodiversity loss on your business or nature loss, be it water, other sort of parts of the environment, but also thinking through the flip side, which is what is my impact on nature and how do I shift the balance on that. That will potentially provide a framework in which to shift business views and action on some of those areas.
Brett.
I gotta be cautious because I'm going to quickly get out of my depth here, but so we recently did a little bit of work that was looking at about 700 different Australian businesses, and it was done in partnership with Goldsmiths at the University of London. And the reason why we did that work was because they had done similar work in the UK. And this conversation around the value of natural capital, I think one of the things that very clearly came back of it, like Andrew, to your comment, like I think what we're saying is in Australia, the value of natural capital is not as prominent as it is in other markets around the world. And I think there are other examples of where we can look at, whether it be in terms of policy or practice or incentives that are there to take. But I would say we are a laggard in that domain.
I would say that as well. Brynn.
As someone who works every day with market power, what I'll say is that there are some things that markets are not best placed to do, and protecting nature is one of them.
Interesting. And yet we are moving towards that. Very much so. All right. In the time available, which according to this timer down in front of us is 5 minutes and 27, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The 2 points that I do want to get to is 11 and 12. And I know that Skye is very interested in both 11 and 12, as I suspect will be Microsoft and Ilona in particular. But I very much welcome views back from both Brynn and Hudson in relation to what we call the true value creation. So in this particular case, the aspiration is to accelerate adoption of high quality reporting frameworks for corporate climate risk. And we all know that TCFD, Task Force on Related Climate Financial Disclosure, is definitely out there. but we're advocating the integration of climate and financial data in report evaluation frameworks and stakeholder analysis to shift capital allocation towards true value creation. Too aspirational, total bullshit, it's entirely achievable. Discuss.
I'd like to think it's achievable, but maybe not in a really, like, it may not happen quickly. So...
But, well, you say that, and I'll push back on that. I would have said the same thing, but for at COP21, we had two major organisations deciding to merge to turn into IFRS, and now we have at least, in a very short period of time, a discussion and consultation going on around two major international standards around climate and more broadly sustainability.
I think they're absolutely key, and I think any reporting framework does need to be aligned with that. I guess I'm thinking in terms of we're looking for reporting solutions now. So we're looking for what information do we put into requirements so that we can report through to government on how we're performing against certain objectives and targets. But we know this is coming. We know that it will have a big impact on business, and I would like to think the more we can be aligned in terms of what information is collected and reported, the better. Otherwise, we're not putting our efforts into the right common goals to get the maximum impact out of the effort we put in. So I think the international standards are a key part of becoming aligned on this, but there is also a lot of work that then goes into how do you then operationalise that within an organisation. So it's within reach, but I would say, you know, it's within 12 months to 2 years type thing for people to get these standards, work out what it means for them, how do they start reporting, how do they start incorporating or changing their operations to capture the information they need to feed up through the system to report on.
Okay, anybody want to add or reflect on that?
From a built environment perspective, if you are a board member signing off on reports that haven't factored climate risk into your assets or your construction activities, I would say that you're negligent, because the physical world has changed and is continuing to change and is doing so more rapidly.
Let me push back on that. I've heard in the last few hours from somebody that until the mining sector is told it has to report against it, no board is really going to give us stuff about TCFD other than making sure that they put it on their website.
Well, I would argue that if they are building in a flood zone and haven't declared that, you know, that is a fiduciary risk. If they haven't factored in the embodied carbon that adds to their overall climate exposure when they, you know, sign off on a new runway or a new road or a new housing development, then that is a fiduciary risk. And, you know, the Australian Institute of Company Directors has spoken about that. The Reserve Bank has spoken about that. You know, there's now legal precedent that's spoken about that. Local government has had legal advice, you know, twice in the last, 5 years to say you must factor climate risk into planning decisions and asset allocation decisions. So I'm not an expert on, you know, the governance and the report writing, but when sustainability reporting, which is often in a corporate setting, you know, good news storytelling, the reality of the flip side of sustainability is the risk. If you're not disclosing that and have that factored into your strategy on how you deliver what you do to create value, then I don't think you're meeting your fiduciary responsibilities.
Can I so I completely agree with you. So it's kind of coming at this at different angles. So there's a responsibility that businesses have themselves in terms of the risks and the mitigation measures they put in place. Also, just, you know, any organisation with certification against a quality environment or environmental system or health and safety, they are required to identify risks that are associated with their organisation and the needs and expectations of internal and external interested parties. So any organisation that has ISO 9001, 14001 or a health and safety certification, what you described is a process they should be putting in place by default. So there's other and then management system standards. So there's other frameworks or requirements that require or put these practices into place within an organisation that then hold them accountable outside of a more formal accounting type, annual statement type reporting framework.
So I'll go Brett, Ilona, Brynn. Go.
Ooh, I'll try to go quickly. I think there's the risk aspect of it, and then there's just the general reporting and disclosure from a transparency standpoint. And, we look at the Australian market today, only half of Australian businesses actually invest in tools to help them with measurement. We're talking about a process that's hugely manual today. And so we touched at the beginning on some of the market piece that needs to happen. For me, the two other pieces are around the kind of meaning of net zero. Even when we're making these statements, what are we actually including in them? Are we covering scope 1, 2, and 3? Are they verifiable? And then that measurement, effectively what we're talking about, there needs to be standards and interoperability between those standards, because you need environmental controls akin to the financial controls that we have today. So I believe that we can do it, but I would say even if you have intent, how is very difficult today.
I would say if we look around the world, a number of countries have moved towards mandatory climate-related risk disclosure and reporting. So legislative requirements that companies of a certain size must disclose climate risk. We got guidance here in Australia, but we haven't yet got that mandatory obligation imposed on companies. Putting the obligation there is one thing. The next thing is what is actually the content of the disclosure, which comes back to the ISSB recommended standards for climate and sustainability risk. And that framework, if it's universally acceptable, provides a consistent and comparable approach. You would think that from a regulator and an investor perspective, that would be the point that you want to be at, where you've got information that is uniform across the board in terms of its content and its quality.
And Brynn?
I think conventional accounting treatment of climate risk is done poorly across Australian companies, that risk doesn't appear, both transition risk and physical risk, systems risk over time doesn't appear appropriately on many balance sheets, and there probably are already enforcement mechanisms that could be used. But I guess we have a vacuum of enforcement action, and it's something that we need urgently to correct. I think if Australian law was properly enforced in relation to companies, their risk disclosures and their climate-related risk, and that we would see massive failures be highlighted, and that would probably have a flow-on effect into directors' duties, but we just haven't seen it, and we're running out of time.
Absolutely. And our policy requirement is the adoption of mandatory sustainability reporting requirements such as TCFD. So it's not just TCFD. It's coherent and compatible across jurisdictions with greater convergence of ESG standards. So the last is, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on this, so you're off the hook, is one that we are actually proposing as a real challenge in one sense to business, which is that, and we call it accounting for business action. And it's the 12th priority, and if you haven't seen it, I'll read it out, which is to consolidate data from existing corporate greenhouse gas reporting into an aggregated corporate determined contribution, and use the annual UNFCCC process to assess business progress against targets. So we've said that we're happy to have the UN process, as flawed as it may be perceived by some, and is in fact perceived, not perceived, it's actual in a number of respects, but it is a universal ground truthing of what is the commitments not made by just countries, but could also be made by companies, so that there is a universality of a Bunsen burner being applied across all of the relevant key stakeholders in relation to our efforts towards decarbonisation. It's interesting that the requirements that we've asked is to introduce what we call the CDC, the Corporate Determined Contribution, that would be structured around simple reporting, adoption in the current UN structure process, and that it be, and this is the one that I love the most, open source and highly accessible to all stakeholders to query and analyse. So that's the session. Thank you so much for joining us both here and online in the virtual world. I hope if you haven't yet completed the survey that you will do so, and just as importantly, you will tell at least 9 of your friends to do so also. What we're going to be doing is leaving this open and sharing it on the BCSD platform up until the first day of COP, the 7th of November, and we will be sharing the results at COP at a business forum as part of the World Business Council to give the world an understanding of what the business in Australia position is going to be around this commitment of a manifesto towards climate recovery. But for now, would you please with me thank Brynn, Brett, Skye, not Skype, Ilona and Hudson for joining us today. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. I really enjoyed your imagery of the Bunsen burner using hydrogen gas, of course,
yes,
there. Yeah,
yes,
green hydrogen. All right, now we are moving straight into our round tables. Remember, as of yesterday, there's a lot of concurrent round tables going on all at once, so there's plenty to pick from. And don't worry, all the content from those round tables will be recorded and available for 3 months. Big thanks to our recording partners there, the Australian Signals Directorate. Also, for those in person, you might need a little bit of a hand to get to your next round table. There are folks outside who can guide you, and be aware that what's in the program is incorrect. A few of the sessions have changed rooms. Namely, the industrial carbonisation has merged with transitioning heavy industry and justice for workers. Both will now have a collective meeting in seminar room 7, that's upstairs in building 32. We're also shifting the health roundtable to LT01 in building 30. This is the first building with the BFF sign on it. Okay. All right, so head on over to the breakout rooms right now, and then we'll be back here at 4 p.m. for some afternoon tea and our final session. And then we'll have our assembly, and we'll check out some digital cartoons from Josie as well. Thanks very much, everyone.